Hi, SMI team. This is Lisa Homan.
Hi, SMI. This is Donna Drummond.
Greetings, SMI teammates. Matt Gattuso here.
Hello, everyone. This is Kyle.
Greetings, SMI members. This is Lara Latham.
Hello, SMI members. I am so excited to see everyone again in person.
This is Marisa Fairbaugh. I hope to see you very soon.
And I couldn't be more proud to be a part of such an extraordinary organization and industry over the past 2 years as we have faced the pandemic together.
Our industry is experiencing unprecedented impact on our global supply chain, ranging from raw material constraints and logistics and transportation headwinds to record demand for PPE and ongoing labor shortages for products made in the Americas.
Our experiences these past 2 years have validated more than ever the importance of the relationship between providers and suppliers. Together, we support our clinicians and patients.
It was through and with the discussion with so many of you during that time that we made it through. It was knowing that we weren't alone. It was knowing that I could call someone, talk, and network, problem solve, think about things a new way, and listen to the great ideas that all of you had.
I'm so looking forward to being able to once again be together in person, nurturing the community that makes SMI so special. The open sharing of challenges, exchange of ideas, and collaborative spirit between our members is what makes SMI so special. And it's more important now than ever as our industry embraces this time of transformation.
We learned so much over the last couple of years, and I'm so looking forward to working through the challenges and making our supply chain better together, because SMI is the perfect place to do it.
I'm just excited that we are coming back together in person, that we're going to see each other again, because we are battle buddies and we've all been through this time now together. I welcome you to SMI with so much gratitude and so much excitement.
Hello and welcome to our SMI Industry Partner Panelist discussion today. I am Nancy Anderson, the Associate Executive Director of SMI, and we're just delighted to have you here. This is the final program in our series of winter virtual events, and upcoming soon, as you saw in that video, is our spring forum in person, which we're really excited about and hope that everyone has registered. All of our SMI members will be able to join us in Orlando together in person, finally, after this long hiatus. So we're looking forward to seeing you all then. Really excited to have our great panel with us today to share thoughts on the industry partner side of what's been going on over the last 2 years and where the industry partners see things going for SMI as we move forward. So really lucky to have a great panel here today. Facilitating is Steve Gundersen, our SMI board chair. He's joined by Lara Latham from Stryker, Christine Arme from 3M, and Matt Gattuso from Owens Minor. And again, we're just thrilled to have them here with us today. We will be taking questions as you go along today, and you can put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A feature. We will save the questions for the end because we have a lot of material to get through with these great panelists today. So we want to make sure we get through as much material as possible. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will submit the questions to the panelists and ask them to submit written answers, and we will publish that to all of our SMI members. And we are recording this today, so you can share it with other folks after. We'll make it available to SMI members. And so without further ado, I think that's all the housekeeping I have to share today. And again, we're very glad to have all of our members and guests here today to hear our wonderful panel. And Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, SMI members, for joining us today. This was my idea a few months ago. After 2 years of all of us, both providers and industry folks, working together to meet the unprecedented challenges, and that word unprecedented is used a lot, but clearly unprecedented challenges brought on by the pandemic. I asked Jane, Nancy, that we as industry folks provide some perspective on the recent past and views going forward, and what better group of individuals, Lara, Matt, and Christine, to provide perspective, both from themselves as leaders of the industry, but also as the organizations, the important organizations that they represent. So grateful for everyone to be part of this today. Our objective, as we had communicated, is to provide a little bit of focus on the recent past, but also think about how we're going to collaborate going forward to, enhance this important industry that we're all part of, and also share some perspective on, the traditional models of sales and marketing and other things, and also get a little bit into continuum of care. But let me kick this off. I'm going to ask each of the panelists this first question, which is really about the unparalleled times that we've been through, and certainly unparalleled in terms of demand for some products, lack of demand for other products. There's been global constraints in transportation, raw material challenges, and inflation, not to mention all the work challenges. And this goes on for everyone within the healthcare environment, and also a high level of visibility from the White House to your neighbor next door asking you questions about products. So Christine, I'll start with you if you don't mind, and just if you could give the group here on the call a perspective of kind of your life over the last 2 years representing 3M.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to address the first question. The word that always comes to mind when people ask me about what's it been like, is challenging. And I think we've all probably been able to use that word in one way, shape, or form, just as humans going through this whole thing. But also inspiring. I sat back and I really reflected on it, because while it was the most challenging 2020, for sure, the most challenging year of my leadership experience, I was also very inspired about how people came together and stepped up and collaborated. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, as this continues and we're here today, exhausting is probably the next word. And I think everyone can relate to that too. 2020 was very different than 2021. Obviously, we were still faced with supply challenges, but in 2020, it was demand outpacing supply, but there was no supply disruption. We were producing things every day. And so cross-functional teams would get together 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day. And that was inspiring to have, leadership all coming together and reviewing. And we knew what was being produced, in terms of the N95s. And we got back together at the end of the day to ensure that every single last one of them went out the door. And every day we were sending things and we were overnighting things. And that had its own level of satisfaction to it, right? It wasn't enough and it was frustrating, but just, we knew that was, happening. And so 2021 is different in that it's kind of, we're experiencing the ripple effect of what COVID has done in terms of, raw materials and transportation, the things that you mentioned. And so there are times that we don't have things going out at the end of the day. There might be a week where things aren't going out, or it might be sitting on a truck somewhere and it's just not getting to where it needs to go. And that there's a different level of frustration that comes with that, because, you almost feel paralyzed in some ways. And so it's been interesting. It's been rewarding, frustrating for the most part, but now it's how do we get our teams motivated? How do I, after 2 years, we're going into the 3rd year of this, because this team, very, very much in, January, February of 2020 has been running really hard, addressing issues. And so now I'm looking to find the right balance for them and help lead through this. So that's what it's been like to walk in my shoes.
Yeah, well, that's well said in a short period of time. Matt, your situation at Owens Minor, obviously the manufacturing of the PPE, the Halyard products, as well as the responsibility around distribution, puts your organization, yourself in a unique situation. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, Steve, thanks very much. And much like Christine and 3M, our organization sells a lot of PPE, certainly made here in the Americas as well, which I think puts us in a little bit different boat similar to 3M. And we had over 1,000% increase in N95 production in 2020 alone. We set up a manufacturing plant in just 4 months, which is unheard of, unprecedented time to do that in Del Rio, Texas, and set up 11 new lines for N95 production there, which was really inspiring to see the work of not only our teammates in the manufacturing group, but also the folks that help build the components that go into those machines. So those contractors that worked with us from the component materials that go into those machines, they actually were inspired. They had signs up in their production facilities saying, the work you're doing is saving lives. And that really resonated with me and resonated with our team, so that everybody rallied around the urgency of getting this done quickly. And obviously the regulatory environment in the state worked with us closely to make sure that we got things done quickly in that environment. So excited to be able to do that. Similarly, we had a 1,500% increase in production of isolation gowns as well. Again, unheard of to think of our manufacturing team adding about 4,000 or 5,000 jobs over the course of that period of time, being able to recruit those people who came to work every day, working in our Latin American facilities to get that out as they were working in their own villages that were riddled with COVID as well. So that definitely was a challenging environment for us as well. I think if you think about some of the other great things that we did from a distribution perspective, our distribution team responded like we've never seen them before. I mean, the amount of energy it took to deliver PP to New York City as an example. I mean, we had some hospitals that were getting 8 truckloads a week of isolation gowns alone. If you think about that, 8 truckloads of isolation gowns alone to one individual facility in New York City, it's unprecedented times. And you referenced that word earlier, but I'm not sure what else you can think about it. Then you talked on the personal side. On the personal side, I don't think there's a person in America other than somebody that was in our industry that knows what an N95 was prior to this pandemic. And now you turn the nightly news on, and certainly throughout the course of 2020 and most of 2021, N95s were the lead story on the nightly news. And my kids and neighbors and everybody else now understands a little bit better about what we do and why we do what we do every day.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see your CEO arrive in the Rose Garden one random March 2 years ago, talking about company. And then in my case, with my neighbor asking me about the efficacy of the BD test swabs. I never thought I'd encounter that. So you get the whole range of questions, but it does speak, those demands that you're talking about, Matt and Christine, are incredible to think that you could respond to 1,000% increase in demand. I'll ask both of you this, I guess maybe unique question, maybe Matt first, or with regard to, is there a specific situation in all this chaos that kind of stands out to you?
So I think probably the thing that stands out the most to me that reminded me of the gravity of the situation that we're in was when I received a call from the city of New York looking for additional body bags. And in my entire career, I never had even thought about the fact that we even sell those through our distribution channel. But obviously, we sell everything a hospital needs, and sadly, body bags are one of those. But there was incredible demand for those at the peak of the pandemic. And when you get that type of call, it just puts things in perspective about we're dealing with patients' lives here each and every day.
Yeah. I think a couple of things come to mind for me. One was the fraud that happened, just the level of people trying to capitalize on a terrible situation. And, we stood up a team. I think there were 24 FTEs at one point to help people manage through what's real and what's not. And I remember those calls where people would, share, hey, this has come across my desk. Can you, do you think it's real? And it just sounded, when you stepped back and listened, it sounded absurd, but that there was such a level of desperation. People wanted to believe. They wanted to believe that they could get this. And that was hard. That was super hard. On a more positive note, there were days where I remember one specifically, we knew it was coming out of production at the beginning of the day, and we made sure that everything went out at the end of the day. And sometimes at the end of the day, that manufacturing team would overexceed, because at that time we had people wasn't the problem. We actually had extra engineers from other departments that didn't, those were shut down, coming over to try and help boost productivity, to find ways to make more faster. And so we had an extra truckload on a Friday night. And if we would have put that with team drivers, which is what we did, trucks were not allowed to stop. That's why we had two. Number one, because we didn't want them, because of fraud reasons, to be hijacked or anything. We just kept them rolling. But number two, we had to get it there. And so at the end of the night, it was really when New York, as you mentioned, Matt, was just really under fire. And it would have taken 2 days with the team driver. And the other option was chartering a plane to the tune of like $80,000. And within seconds, we all went to do it. And the collaboration on the other end, being able to reach out to the distributors and their locations on the East Coast to say, hey, this is coming, get ready to receive it. And then they get the ball, and they literally were bringing it to the hospitals, within, hours of it receiving there. So those were times when, even though it was so dire, you still felt, good, we did it. So extremes.
Yeah,
Christine, there really wasn't a sense of accomplishment by all teammates each and every day. It just felt like you did something. I mean, sometimes the work that we do, Steve, as you know, the cycle can be very long. If you're pursuing a new account or something, that could be 6 or 12 months or even longer at times. But this was a period of time where each and every day felt like, gosh, I accomplished something today. And you also felt at the end of the day that there were probably 10 things you weren't able to accomplish, but there were 110 that you were.
The impact of the full supply chain, from manufacturing through the distribution methods within the companies, then out to the providers, and the very important connection to healthcare workers and patients. There was, to your point, I've experienced that myself, just a high degree of pride through that, but a lot of stress, as well as, a lot of folks who were feeling vulnerable because the demand that was there, and this fact of it bringing out the best and worst of people at the same time. Lara, you're not necessarily focused in the PPE world, but a very important company in Stryker, and certainly a lot of dynamics at play for your organization and yourself. Wanted to get some perspective from you with regard to your experience, say, over the last couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think different, certainly different in the direct PPE, but I think, all the words that Christine and Matt used, I would say, were the very same ones to describe the experience of the last 2 years for our teams and for our partnerships with our customers. I think pride is probably the other one that we would all share, is just so proud of how our organizations rallied around to first and foremost protect our people. And we put our employees at the center of really all of our decision making in terms of the health and safety, number one. I think the other thing that sometimes gets lost in this, and Christine alluded to it a little bit, but as you said, we did have parts of our business where demand disappeared overnight. All of the elective surgeries were shut down. And so we then had less demand for products. And so a big part of our conversations early on was, how do we shift resources and shift people from lines that we're going to actually dial back to lines that we need to ramp up? And so, you don't always think of us as a traditional PPE, but we'd received a call from the state of New York that said, we believe we're going to be short 10,000 beds. And so you start to figure out, you're one of sort of two major bed manufacturers in the United States. We manufacture all of our beds in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and there was no way. You did the math. We don't have enough lines. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough. You can't meet that type of demand. And so the teams rallied and the engineers put their time and their mind to create the emergency relief bed and created and met that demand of 10,000 beds. Now, we guessed wrong, right? I mean, I think that's the other part of this is that, but there wasn't a financial conversation about, you know, is that a good financial decision? It was absolutely our ability to meet the demand of our, you know, our customers and our country at the time. And so a lot of pride to see that type of innovation that happened in that space. We have stories of our engineers working one-on-one with physicians in labs to create splitters for ventilators so they could actually run 2 patients off one vent, and 3D printing those kinds of things. And I think what it for me, it says there are so many assets that exist within our mutual organizations that when we work together, we really can solve problems and innovate. And much like Christine said, nobody asked if there was going to be a financial ROI at the end of that. That was clearly what we needed to do and where we needed to be. But the financial ROI was real. And so, you know, I don't want that to get lost in the conversation as you watch, as our customers did, their revenue stream of elective surgeries disappears overnight. And so how do you think about keeping your employees employed? You know, it was, you can't shift everybody. You have, you know, at least providers could say, gosh, we can redeploy the nursing staff, but you can't do that. So we had to think about how do we appropriately furlough people where we're going to keep lines down. We had to think about, are there actually product categories where we don't have supply health that even though we don't have demand, we're going to keep those running. So we're going to use this opportunity to return some of our product lines to a healthier level. And those are all financial decisions that you're having to make and weigh as you're watching your revenue stream kind of disappear. So, you know, we did have to pivot in terms of how we did that. The other thing that, you know, we had to figure out is how long is this going to last? And what are those projections? And so we had teams of people projecting, talking to our surgeon partners and customers around, you know, what they anticipate, and are patients even going to want to come back to hospitals? And so I think just trying to figure that piece of it out was a huge part of it. We didn't want to be right in our projections that we thought it was going to take a couple of years to recover, but, you know, here we are. Unfortunately, we're still, you know, watching that recovery happen. And then the other thing that for me was super fascinating is that we still had to innovate. So as we came out of 2020, where we were trying to figure out how to help meet the need, whether it was reprocessing N95s, whether it was these emergency relief beds, the kinds of things that we did, we also didn't have our engineers in our offices. And so they knew that we needed to continue to innovate and bring things to market. We actually had engineers that were sending products to their garages, and they were setting up testing facilities in their garages. And so we launched a new product earlier or mid-year last year, that all the final validation and innovation was actually done in the garages of our engineers to be able to do that and move that forward. And, you know, to me, those are the kinds of things where that are just super inspiring and I think get lost in the conversation around what we're doing. And the last thing I'll say, and I don't know if you're going to ask me this question or not, but you know, the sort of key moment that sticks out is I was on a call as we were modeling things out. You know, trauma didn't stop. And so you're kind of saying, well, all of these elective procedures, but trauma didn't stop. And we were on a call, a cross-functional call, and our supply chain guys were talking about the work that they were doing to help customers potentially secure masks and things, but really we had to secure the same for our field folks that were going in these hospitals every single day. And we were having some of the same challenges of needing to protect our employees who were still supporting these cases that didn't stop happening. And the general manager, the president of our trauma division, said, you know, our teams are going in every day, and this is New York, and that's your first data point. And they aren't saying they can't cover a case. And they were telling stories about literally stepping over bodies to cover cases. And I think your world changes when, you know, you all of a sudden are kind of brought into the reality of what's happening in these healthcare systems. And, you know, we go in and out of hospitals all day long covering cases and supporting the clinicians. But for the trauma teams, I think that's still very real. And they're they're still dealing with that the same way many of the frontline providers are dealing with it.
Yeah, incredible stories. I have a simple question that may not be so simple. And Matt, maybe I'll ask you first. Are we out of the woods?
I definitely don't think we're out of the woods yet, Steve. And what concerns me probably more than are we out of the woods is, have we learned any lessons from the woods that we've been in? And so I think what I'm a little bit concerned about, quite frankly, is some folks, I think, have short-term memories. And what I mean by that is, throughout the pandemic, we heard the importance of Americas-based manufacturing. I actually just saw a question come across from Robert Hanfield about should we be pivoting to more Americas-based manufacturing? And so I'll try to incorporate my answer into this same answer to you as well. So the short-term memories piece is they ask about supply chain resiliency, and they ask for guaranteed supply and things like that. But we invest in Americas-based manufacturing, and we're a month or two beyond the last peak of the pandemic, and it's all about price again. It's, what's the lowest price? And I see decisions being made about going to the low-cost countries again, and it's the words aren't matching the actions if you think about it. And so I think that we've got to really reflect on that and figure out, quite frankly, as this SMI organization, how do we solve for this conundrum? Because we can't continue to make these investments and be there only to save the day when we're in the middle of a pandemic like the one we just experienced. And then try to keep these machines warm and keep employees available that are trained, ready, and active to move on these, unless we've got some level of consistent demand. So this is definitely a conundrum that needs to be solved, and we probably need some collaboration between government and private partnerships to be able to do that effectively.
Agreed.
Christine, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Matt just said, because we saw this really cycle through, and so toward the end of last year, the demand had almost completely fallen off, at least for N95s, and then within 2 weeks, it was a spike like we never saw before. If you look at the graph, the first two COVID, the first experience and then Delta are waves compared to what Omicron showed up as. And so I think, if anything, we need to learn to plan for the worst case scenario, but we have to do that as an industry because we all play a role in that. That can't be all the manufacturer. It certainly can't be all the distributor. It can't be all the provider. It's got to be all of us. And I think federal and state and local governments have to play a role in that too. And we have work to do there as an industry, to form those relationships, to get a plan, to be able to, to activate when it's time, because it is just not, you cannot ramp up production overnight. It takes people, it takes, it just doesn't happen. And then to go on full speed, we've got to keep it warm. Like Matt said, we have to, and be able to tap into the supplies that we have. And I think we all have to play a role in that.
So what I'm hearing from the three of you is there are lessons learned clearly. And I believe that all of us in the industry, providers and industry together, have really learned a great deal. And Lara, your lessons, very internal, but also with customers. And one of the things that I picked up, Lara, in your conversation was around visibility to procedures, but basically visibility to demand. Are you making the right stuff? And I think that's applicable to anybody who's making any products these days. Is, do we have visibility to not only what demand is today, but demand in the very couple of weeks and down maybe a year? Any thoughts when we start talking about collaboration, around visibility of demand, Lara?
Yeah, maybe I'll take it when we talk about all healthcare is local. And so, visibility of demand in our procedure-based drivers is all about visibility to the schedule, whether that's the OR schedule or the neuro radiology schedule, whatever it may be in terms of where you're at. And I think there's still a lot that we can do locally to talk about that demand. I don't know that, and I hold a perspective that may be different than others, or it may be unique to our categories. I don't think any individual facility's demand actually can influence our manufacturing plan. I think that that is based on, historical demand, utilization, macro trending. We're far enough along kind of in that than any single facility's demand probably doesn't influence our manufacturing materially. We're just not consolidated enough as an industry to do that. But I do think demand matters when we talk about the movement of trays and implants and things that are, equipment that's required for procedures. And how do we build a network that can share assets and resources in a more efficient way? And so, demand to those kinds of things, I think there's a very practical application to some of the things that we're talking about, and a better connection between the provider and the supplier. And I do think there's something about a local network, though, that has more immediate return than if we're looking broadly in that space. I don't know when we get to a point where we've consolidated or aggregated enough volume to be able to have a single organization materially impact a build plan. I don't know if Matt and Christine have a point of view on that, but.
Lara, I think there's absolutely an opportunity for supply chain innovation here. And I do think it's going to take an organization like SMI to be able to shine a brighter light on this and help understand how do we get the right minds around the table, whether it's academics like Robert Hanfield, who just asked that last question from, I think, the University of North Carolina, State, I think, collaborating with those of us in industry and the providers to identify better solutions to this. Because I mean, now we've seen what the problem looks like. We've maybe used toothpicks and bubble gum to some extent over the course of the last couple of years to solve some of those problems. But I think with the quick reflection on what we've challenged or the challenges we went through, we'll be able to better put a plan in place to hopefully solve it more effectively if this happens again in the future.
Yeah, and I think early indicators, if there's a way, I know Lara, you mentioned in our previous discussion, some of the things that happen first that then we see and experience in healthcare. So I think we could all, probably come together and think through what those early indicators are that translate to the hospitalizations, to the trauma. I mean, some of the things that we actually saw happening, I know, and there's forecasts, and the ability to have visibility to that, I think, is super helpful, because it is demand planning has been a huge challenge in this industry. But I do agree that just locally, I don't think we can get there. But as a whole, I think we'll see a lot of things that will be patterned that then we can learn from.
Steve, just building on it a little bit. Sorry, Lara.
No, go ahead.
If nothing else, we saw how fragile the global supply chain is throughout the pandemic. And, we obviously saw a situation with the container ship being stuck in the canal, which had nothing to do with the pandemic, but it was just further icing on the cake, if you will. But certainly the pinch points of the global supply chain, and then certainly the expense of the global supply chain. Container was $2,500 to $3,000 to bring over from Asia. Pre-pandemic is now 10 times that. And so that has a direct impact on the cost of supplies for those folks that are manufacturing abroad. And so how do we solve for that? How do we make those investments in the Americas-based manufacturing so we can keep the stuff closer to home?
I think 2 points. One is Christine made, sort of made the comment around indicators. And I do think that there's a opportunity as an industry for us to think about, some of the things we were doing when we were modeling in the early days was, what are the drivers of trauma, right? So we know the drivers of trauma are automobile accidents, they are sports, Saturday softball games, sports and athletics, and they're actually, in a big part of our world in facial trauma, it's actually bar fights. And so all of those things were decreasing. So you kind of could watch that Google activity and the decreasing. And so we actually initially projected that we would see kind of compression within that, because the natural drivers of trauma volume were the kinds of things that were not happening. People weren't driving, they weren't going to bars, and they weren't, getting together to play sports. But what they were doing is climbing up on their roof, shooting themselves with their nail guns. Like all these DIY projects actually created a lot more demand in some of the space. So, data, Google Analytics was only so helpful for us in that space. We should have correlated to Home Depot visits or something probably.
Yeah,
But again, I
staple
just think
guns.
sort of understanding that there probably are drivers like that can help us be on a more macro, on a more macro level as well, in some of those spaces. But
Yeah. All right. I'm just curious, is there a direct correlation between men's league softball and bar fights?
Perhaps so.
There you go. You might just have
Compounding
one indicator
variables,
there.
Matt, is what we end up with in that space for sure.
Only in Boston.
Possibly.
But so there's a couple of things in here too. And we think back to 2019, all the way back then, both at the provider level and the supplier level, inventory is an expense. Lean inventory, efficient inventory. You get into 2020 and providers are, renting out space for little micro warehouses, appropriately so. Everybody's making as much stuff as they possibly can to do the right thing and to achieve that. But things are eventually going to probably slide back into the efficient. So I'm going to ask you, Christine, because you kind of brought this up already.
Yeah.
There may need to be a bolus of inventory sitting someplace that is paid for. And you mentioned the government, and you mentioned interactions with the government. Do they have a role here?
I believe that they do, right? And so we have through SMI, through other avenues, have had a lot of dialogue, with the government, with HHS, around the strategic national stockpile and the role that it plays. And we've had really good conversations about it. There is the need to not only have it, but also rotate it and utilize it. And so, an opportunity, and Omicron was an opportunity to potentially, do that, because as Matt mentioned, and we experienced as well, it takes a little while to gear everything back up when the plane had almost landed. And so in that time frame, to be able to lean into something that already exists, that would play a role in rotation, I think is a big opportunity that still is out there to be capitalized on, in terms of how it can support the healthcare industry to be able to be very agile in having what we need right away. And so I think that SMI can and is playing a role in that. And we need to continue those discussions and to continue to move forward so that we have that playbook written, so that whenever the next wave comes, whether it is COVID or, a disease like we're facing today, or it's something else, there's a lot going on in the world right now, that we're ready to just push that button. We know how we're going to do it, and we can do it really quickly.
Matt, there's another example too, if I recall, of distributors kind of melding data together to help with some of the airbridge activity. I don't know if you I know Owens Minor was involved. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's that old saying of the world's armies will collaborate when the aliens invade, or something like that. And so I think this was an example of that, where you saw all of the industry's distributors come together for Project Airbridge. And you mentioned earlier the reference about the CEOs getting together on the White House lawn, and I think that's just a good example of, hey, drop the swords. We're all in this together. It's all about making sure that patients, clinicians get the product that they need in order to weather these unprecedented storms. And I think that the industry really demonstrated that we put the customer first here, and Project Airbridge is an excellent example of that.
And I think SMI has a unique position. If you think about industry, we were all kind of trying to solve the same questions that Lara was bringing up with regard to when are surgeries coming back, when is this, when's that. in the appropriate way, how do you create or drive an initiative that perhaps provides some greater clarity? I want to move on to our next subject. So thank you for sharing. And that's the question of the kind of the evolution of the sales, marketing, service engine that has been in place. Part of the transition that occurred certainly early on in the pandemic was kind of lack for many sales folks to be actually interacting with customers at the locale they were used to. It's not, again, a generalization. But I wanted to get some perspective, Lara, from you with regard to where you see things. I'll call it traditional sales, but maybe there isn't such a thing. You have any perspective on the topic?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that lead in. I don't know that there is such a thing as traditional sales. I think sales models and the role that different sales professionals support or play in the health system environment is very, very different and very diverse across all of our industries. I think we have the trauma reps that I described, right? And the procedure-based reps who are specialists and support. And we actually see with staffing issues in the health systems these days, the role of those individuals and those professionals being increasingly important. I think sometimes they get a little bit of a reputation as being box openers. But when you stand in an OR and a surgeon looks at their staff and says, have any one of you ever done one of these procedures before? And they all say no. The only person other than that surgeon with the most experience with those procedures in that room is your rep. And so what's the level of, confidence that brings and the importance and the role that they play in facilitating the success of the patient outcome? And I think we have to continue to be mindful of that. And perhaps the biggest mistake is to call them sales professionals when, maybe they have a different title. So, that would be less controversial. So I think we're going to continue to see the importance of those procedure-based reps that are driving value and support to the staff and to the clinicians in those rooms. I do think that we've built some muscles, though, for how we might support these types of procedures in more remote environments. And so what are the things that we've learned that we can do? We can do medical education and training, proctoring with video systems that allow folks to be in one OR and be watching and learning in a completely different place. And I think those are going to be really important ways as we talk about lowering our overall cost to serve. Those are innovations that actually make us better. I think the thing, and Christine can probably appreciate this, our teams that are really aligned to the hospitals and the health systems and the supply chain leadership are trying to figure out how we still connect and engage and build relationships and get together to collaborate when many supply chain organizations no longer have an office and no longer have a place to be. And so I think, that model, we call it sales. I don't ever think it is. I used to say, if anybody calls me a sales rep, but look, I get it. But those I think are going to be really important things for us to continue to navigate in terms of how we create opportunities to workshop and collaborate and come together when more and more of that work is getting moved to a virtual environment. But I think it's the job of all of us is to make sure that when our folks are in your facilities, it's creating value and it's a value added experience. And I think that's the journey we've been on and will continue to be on. I'm not sure that I see the model changing drastically.
Thanks, Lara. And it looks like Steve lost connection there. So
I was going to add.
That means we're on our own, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
I certainly have some thoughts, but go ahead.
Christine, I was going to say, Christine, what's it look like 10 years from now from your perspective?
Well, so the other thing I saw coming out of COVID is creativity, right? How do we help from afar? And to Lara's point, there are times when nothing's going to substitute having that support there with staff, with new staff, with traveling staff, whatever it is. And so we want to be prepared to address and be there for all different types of situations. But remote learning is a real thing. And I think that that's one of the things that we've all had to creatively come up with, ways to provide educational support electronically, with varying different ways to get the touch and feel of the product at the same time. But teams stepped up, and I think we'll see more of that. But sometimes you can't have a substitute for being there, perhaps in the operating room or during transitions. There may not be another way, right? And we have to be open to that.
Yeah, Christine and Lara, I completely agree with both your comments. And I think the one thing that I'll add to it is, I think the level of productivity skyrocketed throughout the pandemic. If you think of the number of customer touch points that you can have if you're running around through an airport and rental cars and all that kind of thing, it's a handful of customer contacts a day. I can tell you that most of the time my calendar and the calendar of my colleagues throughout the pandemic had 15, 17, 18 meetings a day, customer touch points a day on it. Not uncommon for the last 2 years. And so I think the level of productivity and that engagement certainly went up. You do lose that interpersonal connectivity that you can only get over, a face-to-face meeting. But I think surprisingly, some of the connections that have been made and fortified over the course of the pandemic virtually has been a pretty eye-opening for me as well. Surprising, quite frankly.
I think we see that at our level, right? Where the B2B relationship is. And I mean, I certainly appreciate my dog walks in or some kid comes home from school, and I just think the personal and the intimacy and, some of you, I've told this story before, but, a big part, I think, of the journey. And one of the things I love most about SMI is that there's a real recognition that, everybody is human and we're all really, the same people doing the same thing. And I think that humanity has helped as we go through it. I do think it has not been as positive for our field teams, and who are typically, we've actually seen one of our programs, we measure outcomes and compliance to protocols. And we are side by side with the healthcare providers on the floor, sort of managing and monitoring protocols. And all of that had to go virtual. And it completely changed. And we actually manage the outcomes or monitor them and graph them. And the performance in terms of quality outcomes decreased. We just aren't as effective doing that. You can't round, you can't see how people are using products. You can't correct things kind of, when you're rounding versus having to do those in a more virtual way. And I think that's something collectively as an industry, we need to be really careful about, that we don't over rotate on efficiency versus effectiveness. And particularly the kinds of things where you are partnered with an organization to deliver an outcome. That could be an inventory efficiency conversation in terms of turns, the same way it could be walking a warehouse feels very different, than getting on a conference call. I just think we have to be mindful about that. All of us will have my budget for travel doesn't look the same this year as it did in the past, right? Because we've learned that there are things that we can accomplish as effectively virtually as we can in person. But what are the things that really, really require those touch points? And I just think we have to be mindful of that. Suppliers should not be locked out of the health systems that they support. I just think if we're adding value, that needs to continue to be an open door. If we're not adding value, that's a whole nother conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seems like we may have lost Steve again. So maybe I'll come back to Christine with this question. How are you looking at the macro market changes?
It's an interesting point. I think, as if we're going to serve more patients ultimately in that post-acute space, maybe, or in the home, e-commerce is going to play a big role in that, because people are going to need to probably want things delivered right to their doorstep. And I think, reimbursement certainly is going to, drive how quickly that happens. But in terms of, just being able to be a virtual presence to follow that patient where they may go, and ensure that they're getting what they need to be able to heal quickly. we're trying to identify what needs to change as a result of that. But one of the things that we've talked a lot about is digital and e-commerce and education in the home too.
Well, I think, and sorry for dropping in and out here, folks.
You're back.
He's back. It's not polite when the facilitator gets off the line.
Matt stepped in for you.
Yeah. Well, I'm just managing everything myself nowadays. So anyway, I think that's an important point around digital marketing, digital training, and are these investment areas that everybody's focusing on?
So Steve, I'll say I wanted to sort of maybe come back to what I think the real question was what Christine answered was around following the patient through the continuum of care. And so I think that that's the trend that's the most notable for us. And you know, if you look at our organization, we just announced the acquisition of Apria Healthcare to build out on our Byram platform today for our patient direct business. So you know, we truly see that following the patient through the continuum of care to the home environment is critical. And yeah, that's the macro trend that we've been following as well. Maybe Lara's doing a little bit more on the digital platform that she can share.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think digital is going to be a huge part of it. You know, I would say that our focus as it relates to digital, and I do want to talk a little bit about Continuum, but our focus as it relates to digital, it's probably more around how are we leveraging all of the connections and all of the information that the connected devices that sit within these healthcare organizations can be utilized and captured to actually inform you know, care delivery outcomes, efficiency, and things like that. So I think a lot of focus kind of in the connectivity in that space. I think digital and e-commerce is going to play a huge piece to the same. I wouldn't argue anything that Christine said in terms of as we figure out how to follow patients to the home. I think the big trend is the shifting side of care, and you know, whether that means from a hospital to an ASC to a physician office to home. I don't think we even know yet what some of the needs are going to be in order to safely, effectively, you know, treat that sort of patient population. I would say, I said, just, I don't remember who it was. It was probably somebody like Jim Francis, right? Who's always so astute. But I said something like, you know, we're just figuring out how to do supply chain within the four walls of the hospital. And now we've got to build these new competencies that neither of us had. And I think, you know, somebody sort of said, I'm not sure we've actually even figured that out, right? So I do think that there's going to be a real opportunity for us to understand that this is a gap and a learning. Our supply chain isn't built to serve that, right? And most supply chain organizations historically haven't even thought about, you know, I mean, it was a big deal when we started managing supply for physician offices when I was at Northwestern. I think that there are many still maturing into that space. So that's an area probably for us to figure out how we work together, because those are muscles I think the industry is having to build.
I think that, you know, over the course of a brief hour here, we've got ample opportunity for collaboration among all participants in the supply chain, and certainly underscores the importance SMI provides in that in terms of a network and a capability. And the last question, just going to ask each of you before we sign off, and I will indicate that as questions have come up, we will respond to those, and we'll do so to the membership. We'll do it in a communique. And thank you for those who have asked the questions. But to the participants, and thank you, Christine, Lara, and Matt for participating. But just a bit about your SMI experience and how that has had an impact, let's say, on you, certainly in the short term here, but also going forward. Christine?
So I have, this is one of the industry organizations that I have at the top of the list, because we talk about real issues. We are able to collaborate on a different level. And the ability to some of it was mentioned a little bit earlier, and certainly as I watched the video, you know, being able to pick up the phone and say, hey, are we on point here? Is is there more, that we should be doing? And so the collaboration and the insight, because we are in this together as an industry. And if we don't have an organization that brings us all together, we're not going to get it accomplished. And so SMI just brings huge value to us as an organization to be able to do that.
You can only solve so many problems yourself, but we're part of a bigger industry.
Yeah, and I really like, we have taken, that we had the SNS workshop that we did, and then we brought that to the whole industry. And so I think that there's probably more opportunities where we can, share a lot of this even broader, because there's some great things that I think we've done collectively through SMI.
Thank you, Christine. Lara, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just to build and not be redundant on what Christine said, I think one of the things that I most value about SMI is I really do believe this is where the cultural transformation of the provider, supplier, industry partner relationship will happen. So the grace that I am given by my colleagues when I call them with silly questions, or when, something goes bump in the night and somebody can call, the advice and the insight and the ability to really have candid conversations, that is how we will transform the industry, is by continuing to do that. And I just think SMI and the relationships that we build through this community are really, really important to us being able to do that.
Thank you, Lara. And also thank you for your leadership with SMI and the industry. And Matt, I'll let you sum up this, if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks, Steve. I think SMI can uniquely be positioned as a catalyst for change. I mean, this is the one place, as Lara and Christine have said, where we can really just focus on the problems and the challenges that are most pressing to the supply chain, healthcare supply chain specifically, and where we can collaborate and solve problems together. And it's not about, winning business or elbowing out a competitor or, getting one up on the supply chain leader. It's about, hey, how do we solve these challenging problems together? And I think I could probably sum it up best with the ancient African proverb of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that SMI provides that platform for us to do that.
Thank you, Matt. And again, thank you all the panelists. Nancy, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks everyone for the wonderful conversation today. I know I've gotten a lot of great insight, thoughts, ideas. I've been writing furious notes about what SMI can do together going forward. So thanks for all the great ideas. And we really appreciate your being here with us today and taking the time to share with your SMI members, fellow SMI members, and the guests that have joined us today. So thank you very much. And thanks so much to our guests and our members who have joined us today. We're glad that you were able to be with us. We will have a recording of this session that we will send out to our members to share with other folks in their organization if they'd like to. And my final plug, the SMI Spring Forum is in April. The hotel deadline is this Friday. So make sure that you get your hotel reservation by this Friday and register. There is a 72-hour cancel. So even if you were unable to come at the last minute, as long as you cancel 72 hours ahead, which we hope you won't need to, you will have your money back. But we'd like to get as many folks registered in the hotel booked by this Friday as we can, so we can start making final plans for our numbers. So we are really excited to see everyone in Florida in a few weeks. And again, thanks to our panel, thanks to our participants. There will be an evaluation that comes out. So we ask that all of you who are participating complete that, so we have feedback for future SMI events. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Is it just us now?
I don't know.